Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. Before we go ahead and begin, I'd like to remind you that this is election season, which means it's also censorship season for big tech. And if you want to make sure that I and everyone else who works at the Blaze can continue to put out all of the content we're putting out, getting to say whatever we want to say, a great way to do that is to go ahead and pick up some Blaze merchandise. I'm even working now with the guys at the Blaze to go ahead and make sure that there's Auron MacIntyre show merchandise, so that should be in there soon. If you go to Blaze or shopblazemedia.com, you can use the promo code Blaze10 to get 10% off of all of your merch. Again, that's shopblazemedia.com. Blaze10 is the promo code, and that'll help support this show and everybody else who is working at the Blaze. All right. So my guest today is John Slaughter. He is a fiction writer. He's also a Substack writer, and he started a bit of a debate here recently when he pointed out that many people in the kind of new right or dissident right are dipping into thinkers like James Burnham and Sam Francis, who traffic very heavily in class analysis. They take a lot of time to break down and understand the forces of social classes inside our civilization, and that in many ways this means that we are touching on at some level Marxist critiques of our current situation. John is on here to talk to me about that today. Thanks for joining me, man.
Oh, thanks, Auron. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. I actually had the honor of meeting John at the OGC event here recently, so that was really great. Always fantastic to connect these people that you've seen on Twitter or who you've seen on say like the Jay Burden show with people in real life. And of course, he's written a very interesting piece that I think is worth taking the time to break down today. So we're going to jump into that topic, guys. But before we do, let me tell you about job stacking. Hey guys, let me tell you about today's sponsor, Job Stacking. More paychecks, less hustle, working from home. That's what job stacking is all about. If you're a remote or hybrid worker looking to maximize your earning potential, then consider joining the Job Stacking Mentorship Program. The program was designed by Rolf Halse to help you successfully implement a strategy that will allow you to collect multiple paychecks from different jobs without burning out or getting caught by your employer. Job stacking has already helped many people double or even triple their income. Luke Hill, a financial analyst living in the UK, has used job stacking to stack 3 jobs and went from making $5K a month to making $15K a month. But job stacking hasn't just increased income, it's also helping many of our guys gain more independence by no longer being a slave to debt or a single employer who hates their values. Andrew Gustafsson, a credit analyst from Australia, is now stacking 4 salaries, which he used to pay off personal and student debt while buying a home for his family. If you don't currently have a remote job, no worries. The program is also designed to help you land remote jobs so you can get started. So if you want to double your income and stop relying on a single paycheck from a woke employer, go to jobstacking.com/start now. That's jobstacking.com/start now. You can use the promo code Auron and book your call with Rolf today. All right, John. So a lot of people have been talking about how there's this woke right, how many or postmodern traditionalists, and I guess doing a whole show about Marx probably won't help us to dispel any of those rumors. But I do think this is important because I want to clarify at the outset: neither of us are Marxists. Both of us recognize the evils of communism and that Marxist solutions to the problems that he was describing are horrific. They've ended up creating tens and millions of deaths throughout the years and lots of misery. So this is not a show, espousing Marxism or the glories of kind of a communist revolution. But why don't you go ahead and lay out from the beginning for people kind of your thesis as to why you would say that Marx is still something that is taken in account, especially as people start to explore the theories of people like James Burnham and Sam Francis.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if anybody has actually read Francis or James Burnham, but I would say more so Francis, you can't help but notice the Marxist terminology. He often uses terms like the proletariat, the bourgeoisie, the means of production. And when you see that, it kind of sets off an alarm bell of like, okay, this is very Marxist rhetoric. And so what I found was looking at it as I sort of, because I read through your book and I also read Burnham, and I read some of Francis. I didn't quite finish it, but what I noticed was that a lot of the critiques coming from Burnham against the managerial elite mirrored in some ways the critiques that Marx had of the bourgeoisie. Um, and I think oftentimes, a lot of these left wing thinkers, and I think most of us know this, they have they're really good at recognizing the problems of modernity or our current situation. That's just their solutions fall flat. And so I wanted to point to the fact that, like, where Marx is coming from, right, and the time frame he's writing, it's important to understand that so you can see why his ideas are so prolific and how they've infused themselves into the thinkers we're all discussing now.
So let's go ahead and get some basic context around Marx's critique. A lot of people will be familiar with maybe the Communist Manifesto, might have to have read that in college. Most people probably haven't worked their way through multiple volumes of Das Kapital. But what is the context around his critique? When is it happening? What does he get right, or where does he have some valid points when we're looking at kind of in the Industrial Revolution and modernity?
Well, I think you the first thing you have to do if you're going to engage with Marx is you kind of have to go ahead and toss out, his dialectical materialism. You have to kind of get rid of the philosophical part and look at the more practical application, I would say. And he's writing, during the middle of the 1800s, right? So this is right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of people don't take into consideration the impact that had. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, a man could provide for himself through his labor. He could work the land, he could have a trade, and these aren't trades in just the sense of we as we think of them today, like plumbing and electric. I mean, you could be a candle maker, you could be a cobbler, you could be a blacksmith, you could provide for your family through the fruits of your labor. With industrialization, what happens is machines essentially take over that role, and now man is forced to sell his labor as opposed to live off, the fruits of his labor. And in doing that, you force people out of their homes into factories. And Marx is critiquing this, and when he's pointing out things like children being crushed and dying in these factories, this isn't hyperbole. This stuff is happening, and the bourgeoisie class, in his terminology, or the people that own the means of production, are extremely exploitative. They're taking advantage of people. You also have the introduction, of electricity, so now you can work longer hours, and so it completely disrupts man's ability to provide for himself and his family. And Marx is coming in and offering a solution to that. Granted, his solution points to this utopian classless society in the end, which, as we all know, is unsustainable and fanciful. But to understand why his ideas were so pervasive, you have to understand how disruptive that was for people. Um, you even see this in the United States with stories like the story of John Henry, right? He's a steel driving man, and he races this mechanical steel driving machine in a race to see who can drive the most railroad spikes into the ground. He wins, and he dies of a heart attack immediately after that, right? And that story sort of shows to me, it shows that attitude of what is going on is people can see the world is changing dramatically, and you can't stop it. And to try to stop it and stand in front of it, you look at John Henry, it's a Pyrrhic victory. So that's what Marx is sort of responding and critiquing, is this exploitative nature of the Industrial Revolution and the people that now own these means of production.
Yeah, I think there's a couple good points there. First, the thing that you're talking about when you look at Marx and discarding part of this, Alexander Dugin has a great term for this. It's called breaking the hermeneutic circle. Is breaking this idea of how the text should be read and the totality of it, what we're supposed to draw from it, and instead discarding this thing that we know is failed, that we know is not going to be valuable. This dialectical materialism is just not true, and it doesn't lead us to a future that is better. And so we can discard that portion while still being able to draw something valuable from the text. So I think that's a good suggestion from the beginning. And the other thing that you're talking about, which I think is really critical, is recognizing the disruptive nature of the Industrial Revolution. One of the reasons that reactionaries, those of us who are kind of on a different part of the right, are often painted with this Marxist brush is that we are ourselves critical of some of the changes in modernity, which doesn't mean that you are Marxist. It simply means that you also recognize this as a disruptive force, just as Marx did. Marx had actually his solution was to lean into this change. He's actually the first accelerationist. He believes, he describes himself as a free trader because it will break down traditional nations and identities faster, so that he can get to kind of this global communist revolution more quickly. So he's actually, in some ways, a hyper capitalist until it eventually collapses into itself and creates the utopia that actually never comes. But yeah, but a lot of people were talking about the disruptive nature of this. You have guys like Thomas Carlyle who are heavily critical of the Industrial Revolution, the industrialization of Britain, and what it's doing, because in some sense, obviously, the mechanizing of uh, the economy brings great advancements, brings great wealth. It revolutionizes the way that people live. It can do all kinds of amazing things. Many of us would have a hard time understanding how to exist without many of the things, the amenities that industrialization has brought. But it also, like you said, seriously disrupts the kind of cycles of life, the natural rhythms of life that existed in more traditional societies. It rips people away from the land. It creates a scenario where people are more likely to be concentrated into cities. They're pulled away from their roots, their heritage, their peoples, and instead are concentrated into these places that are deracinating. They're cosmopolitan. They don't really have that connection. And also, while it may seem in certain ways that life has improved, like you said, people often lose the dignity of being able to provide in a more classically oriented household, a more traditional household. And so that creates a scenario where people are very alienated from what they do. They lose value. The cold hard realities of kind of the industrial revolution are often swept under the rug, as just a consequence of this great leap forward. To use another Marxist term, or communist term. And so we end up in this scenario where people just take everything, any criticism of the Industrial Revolution, and say this is Marxist. But that's not necessarily the case. In fact, many right wingers will quote, someone like Uncle Ted saying, the Industrial Revolution and its consequences are a disaster for the human race, not recognizing, that they are mirroring certain aspects of Marx's observations in that moment. So there's a way in which a lot of people will just qualify or classify uh, any criticism of this period, any criticism of this great upheaval, as fundamentally Marxist. But we would say these criticisms are correct, but we have entirely different understandings of why they're a problem and what the solution would be.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, there's even more controversial thinkers. George Fitzhugh's was a famous, slavery apologist, and in his work "Cannibals All," one of the things he does is he compares the life of the average slave to the factory workers at the time, and he says, well, these slaves are provided for. They have housing, they have retirement, essentially, they have medical care. And then look at these factory workers and look at the conditions they are currently living in, right? Like, would you trade one for the other? And his arguments are somewhat compelling. It's hard for us now to look back on that because we are so far removed from being able to provide for ourselves. So in our communities, as you said, it deracinates our communities, which used to play a lot of these roles, right? They used to provide for us. You didn't need a retirement plan. You had the church, you had your family nearby, you had the community at large. You didn't need all this stuff. And what the Industrial Revolution does is it takes all that, flips it on its head, and leaves people essentially at the mercy of this bourgeoisie class, again in Marxist terms, right? Because now they own and control everything, and you're at their mercy. And so I think a lot of right wingers understood that as well, but you have this sort of pivot towards a more uh, libertarian mindset within the American right, especially. Um, and with that, the any critique of capitalism, period, gets you labeled as a leftist or a Marxist, even though the the real right wing position would be to look towards a more traditional lifestyle.
Yeah, and this is why so many people don't recognize, they think of um these different responses to kind of a capitalist revolution, and they think that they're all the same, they all have the same core. Of course, people will put, look to the socialists and the Marxists and say these are the same thing. Well, they're fighting against the same the same trend, which is this revolution in capital. But of course, they're actually, ironically, both of them are radically themselves progressive in their solutions to that problem. And neither of them are actually bringing a traditionalist understanding to it. And I think that's what a lot of people are trying to do now, is to understand how you could bring a more traditionalist critique of this back, since all of the ideologies that themselves are somewhat progressive, that tried to battle against liberalism and have failed. What does that new opposition look like? And one of the things that a lot of people, myself included, have found valuable has been the work of guys like James Burnham and Sam Francis. You mentioned that earlier, but I'd like to go a little deeper into that. Why is the class analysis present in those two inspired in some ways by Marx? And why has that been proven so effective in kind of evaluating our current situation in a way that our current political analysis has failed to do?
Well, I think, with Burnham, it should be somewhat obvious to anybody who's actually read Burnham or paid attention to his life. He was a former Trotskyist in his youth, and I think because of that, you can't swim in those waters without getting tainted to some degree. The difference being is that Burnham was willing to look at the critiques that he probably took out of being a Trotskyist and realize the failures again of something like Marx or Trotsky, and looking at this idea that there's going to be this classless society, right? Because that's the big push, as you mentioned earlier. Marx is wanting to push forward and thinks that capitalism is going to collapse under the weight of its own internal contradictions, in his terms, right? And that's going to give way to this classless utopia, essentially. But the reality of that is that that's not possible, and we know that's not possible because we know that sort of class is inherent, right? And when you're reading the elite theorists, they point this out, all of them, that there's always a ruling class, there's always an elite that's going to exist, and that elite class can't be gotten rid of just because of the fact that you want it to, which is essentially what Marx is hoping for. Um, and then you turn to Francis, and Francis uses all of this, the same rhetoric, like I said, from Marx, the same terminologies, and you can almost trace, in my opinion, uh, that the managerial elite is sort of an evolution of the bourgeoisie class, and this is something that the German economist Werner Sombart points out. Was he was critical of Marx as well, and he said that where Marx gets it wrong is that capitalism won't ever collapse. What it will do is it will adapt. It's too flexible, and it will become bureaucratized. And from that bureaucratization, it will become all encompassing, right? And this is something obviously that coincides with Burnham's point about the managerial elite. They've replaced the traditional bourgeoisie class, but they're operating in the same manner. And so I think you can almost, in my opinion, you can look at Burnham and Francis and realize that their class analysis is rooted, it comes from the same source, but their recognition is that there's going to be this class, it's going to exist. The difference is it needs to be restructured and properly ordered, so that the ruling class actually has skin in the game and cares about the people that they're ruling over.
Yeah, that's really critical. I want to go ahead and talk a little bit more about the distinction between the managers and the bourgeoisie, because I think there is important notes there that exist in Francis that do differentiate them. Though I agree with you that there are some there's some connections there, and very importantly, I want to dive into, of course, the way in which we would see class as better structured, the actual right wing solution to this class conflict problem. But before we do all that, guys, let me tell you a little bit about the movie Sound of Hope. Hey guys, I want to talk to you about a wonderful new movie from Angel Studios, Sound of Hope, the story of Possum Trot. It's inspired by the powerful true story of Bishop and First Lady Donna Martin and their tiny Bennett Chapel Church in the town of Possum Trot in the woods of East Texas. 22 families from a rural black church linked arms and courageously adopted 77 of the most difficult to place children in their local foster care system. By doing the impossible, the first 76 kids were adopted between 1998 and 2000, and another was adopted in 2011. This East Texas community proved that with real determined love, the battle for America's most vulnerable can be won, as this act ignited a national movement for vulnerable children that continues to this day. The first step to ending the crisis is to raise awareness. I encourage you to order your tickets to see Sound of Hope, the story of Possum Trot, today at angel.com/Auron. That's angel.com/Auron. The fight for kids begins on July 4th when Sound of Hope opens in theaters. So in Leviathan and its Enemies, Sam Francis talks about the transition between these different ruling classes. Like he said, all of the elite theorists, all of these guys recognize that there will always be a ruling class and that this is inescapable. But Francis talks about how the modes of production and the economic forces change in between each one of these ruling sets. And he says that the bourgeoisie all use things like rule of law, and contract law, these ideas of individual rights as a way to pry open kind of the aristocratic rule and move them and accrue power to themselves. Right? They deconstructed all of the ruling formulas, all the political formulas, to use Gaetano Mosca's term, of the aristocratic class. They kind of broke down all of those pillars of their power, and that's what allowed the bourgeoisie to rise in power. But then the managerial class comes in, and the managerial class, in a similar function, attacks all of the foundational pillars of the bourgeoisie's rule. And so instead of private property and rule of law, we get rule by experts, rule by procedure, the dematerialization of property. And so each one of these things is used to attack kind of that underlying basis. And over time, what we see is that this process, while kind of liquidating capital and allowing for the escape of capital, also removes the connection between the rulers and the ruled. In each one of these steps, it reduces accountability at a certain level, or connection between kind of the people in charge and those that they manage. Some of this is due to massification, its scale. Some of this is due to the mechanisms and the ruling formulas, the way that they bind people, or the way that their stories are no longer particular to specific peoples. But ultimately, the point is that this process is ongoing, and this is why we kind of end up in the managerial mindset. In fact, Burnham isn't really necessarily against managerialism itself, though Francis most certainly is. Burnham is more explaining a historical process that he thinks might be inevitable, as where Francis, I think, is more one who is trying to better understand the mechanisms by which the managers rule so that they might be undermined.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, when you look at Francis, obviously, I would label him, with the paleocons, and it's not just him, but you see this with Pat Buchanan as well. Their advice sort of is to turn to more localized communities, um, and economic practices that prioritize the nation or the people over globalization, right? And I think you know that's where Francis's critique or is I guess more valuable. More valuable than Burnham's, because like you said, Burnham is just kind of he's in that Machiavellian tradition. You see this when you read the Machiavellians, right? It's sort of taking a scientific approach to political analysis. Well, we're going to remove all of our opinions and we're going to look at what is effective and what isn't. And I think that's exactly the way he looks at it. But when you turn to guys like Francis and sort of the paleocons, they have more of a reactionary approach to it, because they're looking at it and they're seeing the destructive nature of it. I mean, I think we all know now that pretty much everything Pat Buchanan said was going to happen has happened.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think that moving forward from that, that's really all you can do when analyzing this, is to realize that Burnham kind of gives you the scientific approach to it and tells you how the mechanisms work. And some of the paleocons and other thinkers kind of try to provide you a way out of it.
So I think the big differentiation here is going to be the way out of it, right? Because what we're saying, and the reason that I think that these thinkers have been so critical to changing the way that the right understands our current situation, the way their analysis has just been way more effective than the kind of political analysis we've had for several decades. The reason that's cutting through now is it does factor in class. It does understand class antagonism. It recognizes the fact that social classes will always exist. This is tough for a lot of Americans in particular because so much of our kind of personal understanding is built on this idea that we eliminated class. You know, we disposed of the ruling class. When we started the United States, it's popular sovereignty. We don't have an aristocracy. We don't have a king. We don't have landed nobles, and so therefore it, you know, without those formal titles it just doesn't exist. But the power of these guys is really to say no, social class does persist. Now, as we pointed out earlier, Marx's solution to the problem of social class persisting despite the industrial revolution and all the upheaval it created was to basically say, well, we should organize along lines of class. We should make class the unifying factor. This is, remember, guys, all politics is identity politics, and Marx just wanted your class to be your identity. And so he would go ahead and say, well, we need to identify as the, you know, the proletariat, the workers. We need to go ahead and rise up against these other classes. That is the key. Is we will organize along these lines. But for a reactionary, the answer is to say, well, it's not so much that we have to get rid of class or we have to organize along class. We recognize that class is going to be a constant inside particular peoples, and instead order that class, those classes in a way where they are beneficial to the people as a whole, right?
No, that's absolutely correct. And it's kind of funny because Werner Sombart actually in his book, I think it's called just Capitalism, I believe, written in 1902, he makes the point that one of the things that prevented the United States from falling into the same socialist trap that you saw in Europe was this idea that there was no class, right? That because Americans didn't see class, Marxist talking points basically didn't hold, especially because at that time period, and for a long time, for you and I both, this was probably true. You could rise up very easily in America. You could move up that economic ladder. Class wasn't really a thing. But what we're seeing now is that, you know, for my children and a lot of the younger people, that doesn't hold anymore, right? The ability to climb up that American dream is gone. And with that happening, the importance of class and the reality that class exists, whether you want it to or not, is becoming more and more real for people. Because if you can't move up the ladder yourself, you're going to have to accept the fact that there are going to be people that are above you, insofar as class is concerned. And the real goal then is to make sure that you're putting people in those positions or encouraging people in those positions to have a sense of noblesse oblige, and to prioritize the people in their communities. And this is also why, you know, the upper class, there needs to be a connection between them and the people they rule over. And this is also why, you know, the globalization of capitalism is so dangerous, because we all just become sort of widgets in the economic machine. We're just numbers on a spreadsheet. So I think understanding that class is real is going to become imperative for the generations coming up, because there's going to be no way to avoid it anymore.
Yeah, Christopher Lash talks about this in Revolt of the Elites. He said that when the Americans kind of discarded the idea of class, the good news, like you said, is that people for a long time were able to climb, and it did make them more resistance to that Marxist rhetoric. But ultimately, what happened was once these classes started to become more concrete, the kind of illusion of meritocracy still stayed around. So even though you had a lot of these guys who are going to, like Harvard or and Yale only because of their parents, that they, wouldn't be able to lead themselves out of a wet paper bag. All of a sudden, they think that they're meritocratic. They got here because they outperformed everybody else, and that means not only are they above those people, but unlike there is no noblesse oblige because they earned it. A hereditary nobility understood that their nobility was tied to blood. It was tied to a certain type of chance that put them into that position, and so they had a tie to the people that they were hereditarily bound to rule over, in a way that someone who simply, "Oh, well, I just kinda outcompeted you in the market. I don't owe you anything. You could have made the same choices I did. You could have worked as hard as I did." They don't have that kind of binding, to the people that they are now over, and they don't even recognize the ruling class nature. Like, they know, "Oh, well, I may run a business," but they don't recognize themselves as then in some kind of distinct social class that gives them both powers and responsibilities. And like you said, the globalization itself is very much a disaster, because that means that each one of these people raised into basically this ruling class, not only do they not have those classic ties of nobility, but they also aren't even tied to the specific people from whom they drew the resources and everything else to arise to their positions of leadership. They see themselves as part of a global leadership community, and all of the things that they're doing are for the betterment of that global network and not so much the individual people that actually gave them the ability to rise up through the ranks. And so this becomes a disaster because we've completely ignored class in the way that it ties us to certain obligations. We have these people who don't see themselves in any way obliged to those they rule over. They don't see that important connection. They don't feel that chain of custody, that chain of being that would otherwise tie them to their ancestors and to their children. And this means that they're more than willing to go ahead and betray the people that they normally should be ruling over, because really, at the end of the day, they don't have as much in common with them as they do other ruling elites across the globe.
Yeah, I mean that's I think one of the most dangerous parts of the globalization. And as you brought up earlier, you brought up Kaczynski, and this goes to Elul as well. They point out that part of it is alienation, right? This hyper capitalist system that obviously has evolved into managerialism and global capitalism. It alienates and destroys communities. It tears up their traditions. It tears up their everything from their religion to their particularities. You see this now. I always tell people that you can track the destruction of a region by the loss of its accent, right?
Mm.
I mean, I grew up in the deep south my whole life. I have almost no accent. Most of the people I know don't have them. My parents, my grandparents, though, have very strong and distinct regional accents, right? And you can kind of see how that has affected everybody just by listening to the way they talk. But I when you look at, I think, um, Christopher Lash's point about the excuse me, about about the sorry, I had a brain fart for a moment
The
there.
meritocracy aspect.
Yeah, the meritocracy. When you look at that and you realize that we were all raised in that environment, and I know you and I both probably saw the film Wall Street, and we were all told greed is good, right? That's the attitude people need to realize that these elites have, right? Greed is good. It's all about the accumulation of wealth. It's all about maximizing efficiency. That's all they really care about. They don't care about you or anybody, or what that you're losing your community or that you're losing your culture. That doesn't matter, right? But it doesn't have to be that way. And I think that's the big thing that I want to kind of enforce to younger people, is that don't think of class in a negative connotation just because the only um, interface you have with upper class is this sort of hyper, greedy sort of Wall Street element. There can be a ruling class that cares about more than that. But as you said, there has to, it's ironic, but it kind of has to go back to some sort of hereditary class where you feel that, God has gifted this to you. It's a blessing. And because it's a blessing, it is your job to make sure that you do the most with it.
So as we look at the legacy of Marx and people approaching him from the right, like we said, we've kind of broken the hermeneutic circle. We understand that there are critical failures in Marx's work, that it leads to very evil ends. We're not embracing uh, much of what Marx prescribed. We're certainly not wanting to accelerate capital to the level of exacerbating its contradictions and then creating a collapse into some kind of imaginary utopia. We're not pursuing that kind of line of flight. That's not the way we're trying to resolve the problem. As people on the right looking at this, though, what do we see here? You've kind of already alluded to it in a few different ways. But if we're saying, okay, look, class is unescapable, there will always be a certain level of class conflict. There has to be the social classes do actually need to actively be taken into account when we're trying to understand society and our duties and roles to each other inside of it. So we can't just dismiss it in the way that kind of the American solution has been. But we're also recognizing that Marx's attempt to just organize across one class and use it to eliminate the others and free everyone is a failure. What is the right wing solution? You've talked a little bit about the possibility of hereditary, the return of hereditary understandings. One thing that I think is interesting in the American tradition is that while we didn't have hereditary monarchies, there was a certain level of understanding that when you have these aristocrats who had earned this, right? There was a certain level of natural aristocracy that was going to arise. Our founding fathers, I think, indicated pretty often that they were looking towards natural aristocracy as the replacement, and that often that would create a hereditary form of this. So there wasn't a formal creation of barons or counts or anything like this, but there was basically this understanding that there would be these great families that would rise up on their own. They would create certain levels of achievement, and they would guide communities, even if did not receive some formal landed title. They would, in many ways, act as kind of the hereditary aristocracies of old. But if there was a failure to hand that torch, from one generation to the next, then perhaps people wouldn't be bound to fail aristocracies in the same way. How would you like to see people on the right approach class in a way that reinstates that natural hierarchy, but does it in a way that's beneficial to the people of America today?
Well, I think first, the first thing I would try to remind people of is it, as you alluded to, there sort of was an aristocracy in the United States. I would use the example of contrasting the French Revolution and the American Revolution. Right, the American Revolution is not a revolution from the bottom. Right, these founding fathers are not. They're not even middle class. These people are ostensibly aristocracy.
Hmm.
And so when this revolution occurs, you're transferring power from basically the King George to an aristocratic class that already exists, as opposed to in the French Revolution where it is more from the bottom up, and you get the Great Terror, right? Because it's just, as we know, most revolutions end up worse than they started, right? Whatever they're trying to fix, they make worse. The reason America works, I think, in part, is because you're giving it over to this class that already exists that's aristocratic. Um, but that being understood, I would say, solution wise, one of the big things that killed the American aristocracy is the direct election of senators, right? Because prior to that, they kind of functioned as the House of Lords or something in a
Hmm.
sense, right? Because they're not elected directly by the people. So moving forward, in order to establish something that looks like a proper aristocracy, I think you have to go back to that. You have to somehow establish that divide where the mass of people are not electing these individuals. But then on top of that, I think the real path forward is to look, as Mosca talks about the social forces, right? As things change,
Hmm.
50 years ago, nobody knew that the tech bros were going to become such a powerful social force, right? Now they are. And so I think we need to look forward, and I'm not sure what those social forces are going to be, but we need to look forward to what they are and try to encourage the type of people we want in those roles so that as those social forces approach, they can get into those positions of power. And I think that might be the best path forward because a side concern is that if AI is able to do what they say it's going to do, we're going to relive the Industrial Revolution again. And you're probably going to see more Marx's ideas become more popular again because it's going to be just as disruptive. So it's good to get out in front of it now and try to put those peoples in positions that are going to take care of people in case these things happen.
Yeah, there's a certain irony where that in the United States was not really subject to a communist revolution due to, in many ways, the level of wealth that had already obtained. You know, there people were not objectively poor enough to really be bought into this kind of need for a class revolution. But what happens when you import, say, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 million illegal immigrants to do a bunch of jobs Americans won't do, and then all of a sudden, you automate all those jobs out of existence, right?
Oh yeah,
You want a class revolution, just wait till that happens.
yeah, and if you're not willing to, and this is kind of where, I think studying somebody like Bismarck is so important, right? Because Bismarck is a contemporary of Marx, right? And one thing that Bismarck understood, his realpolitik, is he looked at these socialist revolutions. He saw what the people were really concerned about, and he cut the legs out from under the socialists. He
Mhm.
said, "Okay, what you're worried about, um, retirement and pay if you get injured or something like that. I'm going to give you that." And doing that was enough to stall. He could have probably done more and done better. And we could argue that he's sort of the precursor to the modern welfare state. But regardless, I think looking at how he approaches things, you can kind of see, okay, we need to take a realpolitik view of this and say, what can we do to prevent these things and not be married to the ideology, which kind of goes back to why we should look at Marx in the first place, you know?
Yeah, ironically, there was a lot of guys during, as the socialist revolutions are building up, who get very angry at union leaders who actually successfully negotiate better living conditions for their workers, because it undercuts the need for communist revolution. And so the successful union leader that's actually bettering the lives of the workers is reducing the need for the communist revolution, is therefore an enemy of the revolution. Before we wrap things up here, I do want to ask you one more thing because I'm always fascinated about this, and I spent a long time thinking about it, and I'm not sure if I have the answer yet, but I always like picking the brain of people who are thinking along this lines. Can we continue to have creative destruction and stable hierarchical societies? Is unbridled capital always going to bring us here? Should we be exercising more influence in the effort to maintain that, or is that a losing battle and you simply have to learn to adapt, like you were talking about, maybe getting out ahead of market forces and placing aristocrats in those areas, trying to ride the wave, ride the tiger as if it were, rather than to tame it.
No, I'm very much in the cyclical history camp. I don't think that I think what we need to be doing is preparing for that system to collapse. Now, I don't obviously don't mean in a Mad Max style. I wrote a piece a while back on catabolic collapse because, in my opinion, that's where it's headed. You're going to see the power of the federal government recede more and more. And as it recedes, opportunities for local authority to establish more power is going to come up. And that is going to be that path forward. I don't think we should be trying to keep the system going or to better it or to just, do the necessary maintenance on it. I think we need to prepare for the fact that it's probably inevitably going to slowly decline. But in that decline, those opportunities are going to come. And one of the things I've been trying to urge people to do lately is that getting into local positions of power, no matter what they are going to pay dividends in the future. Because as catabolic collapse occurs, those positions that you get are going to increase in influence and power. And I think that's where we have to go with it, because I don't really see, and maybe it's because I'm a Christian, but I see all of this as like sort of a Tower of Babel. Like it can only go so far, and then it's going to fall in on itself.
Well, I certainly agree with that. I said very much the same thing in my book, so I'm 100% on board with your analysis there. All right, guys, we're going to move over to the questions of the people, but before we do, John, can you tell people where to find your fiction, your nonfiction, everything you do?
Yes, of course. Yeah. You can find all my writings at on Substack at Texas John Slaughter at Substack. I'm on Twitter at John J. Slaughter Esquire. I recently had a story published in both editions of the Double Dealer. So if you don't know, the Double Dealer is a really great literary magazine that some of our guys have started back up. So check that out when you can.
Fantastic. All right, guys. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up here, but I want to thank everybody for watching. And of course, thank John for coming on. If you'd like to read his most recent piece on Marx or anything else that he's done, you should definitely check out his Substack. If it's your first time on this channel, you should go ahead and subscribe, turn on the notifications, click the bell, because, YouTube's like, oh, you subscribe to this guy, but do you really want to watch him when he goes live? So make sure that you go ahead and do that so that you can hang out with us while we're doing the shows. Of course, if you'd like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you can go ahead and subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast network. And then if you would like to go ahead and pick up my new book, The Total State, you can do that on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, and order it from your own local bookstore if you'd like to support them as well. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.